So I recently did a video going over whether the Premier League is a closed shop or not, and there's a few different opinions when it comes to that. Some people say, well, there's still the opportunity there for sides to be able to break into the Premier League from the Championship and become established clubs. Just look at the likes of, if you're going to include them, Nottingham Forest, Brighton, Brentford. They were all in the Championship not that long ago, but for every one of those guys, there's at least 2 or 3 that kind of yo-yo between the divisions. The likes of Burnley, Sheffield United, Leeds, they're all up and down all the time. Southampton, Leicester are going to become that probably too. Ipswich will probably want to become that, you know, from where they were in League One not too long ago. But on that, does profit and sustainability make football worse? Has it made the game worse? Has it actually had a lot of unintended consequences compared to when it was first brought in? Well, I'm going to attempt to answer that best I can, because this is something that really has been grinding my gears really when it comes to football these past few years. I've become very disenfranchised with football to an extent, you know. As a Sheffield United fan, you know, I'm used to promotions and I'm used to relegations, especially from the Premier League. I don't expect us to stay there when we go up. History tells us that most of our time has been spent in the second tier of English football. That's just a fact. So for us to ever make it into the Premier League is seen as a massive achievement, and it did seem as that for a long time. I'm just going to use my club as an example here, but this can be applied to a lot of different clubs. The vast majority of teams from outside of that top 6, 7, maybe top 10 in the Premier League, you know, there are teams that are usually there more often than not, but for the vast majority of English football fans, or at least when it comes to the vast majority of clubs, it very much feels as though the journey is better than the destination. And what I mean by that is that the promotion race to get up from the Championship is amazing. The first time that we got into the Premier League recently, when we were first promoted back in 2019, right? It was the first time we've been promoted to the top flight of English football since Neil Warnock did it in 2006. And then obviously we went up and then we got relegated straight away. Standard pretty much for us. That's kind of what we do. And it was amazing. It was amazing seeing us break in and get into that first season in the Premier League. And we did so well. We got 9th place, something like that, relegated the year after. Again, not really much of a surprise. But then we came back a couple seasons later, got promoted again, but it didn't have the same buzz around it, because we knew going into that season it was going to be so difficult for us to stay up, and so it proved. You know, we went on to have one of the worst Premier League seasons in history, alongside Burnley, who really struggled. They got promoted and relegated again. Luton Town, they made a good fist of it. They really gave it a good go. They held themselves in high regard, I think. They should do anyway after that season. But this season it's been a disaster for them. You know, they just sacked Rob Edwards literally an hour or two before I made this video here, before I recorded it. So when it comes to that, and a lot of this does have to do with PSR for me. Now, of course, it's always hard to survive in the Premier League. It's been that way ever since the Premier League was created. You know, before that, it was easier to survive. It wasn't too uncommon for sides to get promoted, then even win the league after a couple seasons. Leeds did that in the early 90s. They got promoted, and then a couple seasons later, they won the league. That is impossible to do now, to break into that top 6. And the reason why is because of PSR. That is the biggest reason why. It was always difficult because of the TV money, because of the gulf in quality in the Premier League. But now, instead of it being a gulf between maybe the top couple teams and the rest of the league, it's now, there's another tier system where there's like 6 teams at the top. Newcastle are trying to break into that and make it a 7. Then you've got the teams that are pretty well established in the Premier League, you know, the likes of West Ham, the likes of Brentford these days, the likes of Brighton. They're always in and around there pretty much these days. And underneath that, you've got sides that in truth you could limit to 4 or 5 that are getting promoted and relegated all the time from the Premier League, becoming out and out yo-yo sides. And because of the way that profit and sustainability is set up, it's impossible for even the richest owners, even Saudi Arabia. The state of Saudi Arabia owns Newcastle United for all intents and purposes, and they can't overspend. They can't go over a certain amount. They can't invest £100 million, which is chump change to them, in the squad without having a certain amount of profit, because otherwise it's deemed not sustainable and they will get a points deduction for it, like we've seen with Everton, like we've seen with Nottingham Forest as well. They've both had deductions. Leicester have been skirting around that recently. Newcastle themselves, of course. The likes of Chelsea, they're borderline. Manchester United, borderline apparently, if you believe reports. And before I go any further, I need to explain what profit and sustainability is. Basically, it means in the Premier League context, it's different for different leagues in terms of how it's applied and everything anything like that. But let's just use the Premier League as the example, because that's what we want to use here. Any club in the Premier League cannot go over a permitted loss of £105 over 3 seasons. Now, this may change in the near future, that amount might increase, but for the moment, that's what it is. So it basically means, on average, you can't go over £35 million in terms of an overall loss of the club. Now, there are certain aspects to it in terms of things like youth facilities being upgraded, women's teams, stuff like that. That does not count towards your outgoing. So your actual loss might be larger than £105 million over those 3 years. But in terms of the PSR calculation, it can't go over that or under that, depending on how you look at it, of course, because it's a negative balance effectively. So that means that teams that are wanting to, become the next Chelsea, for example, and this is why, and I mentioned Chelsea because this was brought in to stop another team like Chelsea doing what they did in the early 2000s under Abramovich, where he just pumped hundreds of millions of pounds into the club in a way that was sustainable for him because he could clearly afford it, and eventually it did bear fruit. Manchester City have done something similar, but they've done a lot of it under PSR. They've been quite clever about it at the end of the day, and allegedly illegally so, but we're yet to find out what the court case has to say about that. But they have broken FFP in Europe before, which is Europe's equivalent of PSR. So that has happened. They have broken the rules on that, just like Forest have, just like Everton have here in England. City have done it in Europe as well. And Chelsea, apparently, if they did qualify for Europe a couple seasons ago, they would have fell foul of that too. So make of that what you will. But it basically stops these owners from putting loads of money in. And I get that, because the money will run dry eventually. You don't want to have another situation like what happened with Portsmouth, where they ran out of money. And there's been a lot of teams over the years that have been relegated from the Premier League and have gone bankrupt. Think of Bradford, I think Barnsley did it, Sheffield Wednesday did it, Derby County did it not too long ago, Wigan Athletic, Bolton Wanderers. All these teams were in the Premier League, and within a few years or so, a lot of them were playing 3rd or 4th tier football because they had completely run out of money. So it does help to prevent stuff like that. I will give PSR that. We don't see too much of that happening nowadays. It's very rare, and we've not seen anybody go into administration in the Premier League since Portsmouth. In fact, those points deductions for Everton and Nottingham Forest were the first points deductions in the Premier League since then. What was it, 2009, 2010, where Portsmouth got relegated from the Prem? So it does help prevent that happening. So it has been successful in that so far, I will admit that. But the negative side of it is that it makes the top 6 clubs entrenched. They're invincible. They will forever be able to outspend the clubs below them, pretty much. Newcastle are the only side that could really buck that trend, and so far they're doing a good go of it, but in terms of how much they can actually spend, it's minuscule compared to those other top 6 clubs because they need the support. To get the support, they want to spend, but they can't spend because they'll go over the PSR and they'll get a points deduction as a result. So for me, it's made football a lot more predictable here in England. It has succeeded in its goal of making football more sustainable, but the very terminology of sustainable, when you think about it, it is maintaining the status quo. That is what sustaining something is. And it does maintain the big clubs being big and everybody else being little. And that's what it does. So for me, are they going to change it? Well, they might well make those losses allowable bigger, which will allow clubs to spend more, to have more money pumped into them, because they can effectively lose more money. They can spend more money. So there is that. And whether that gets increased or not, we'll have to see. But even then, you think about some of the losses, like what did Leicester have when they were under investigation? They had nearly £200 million over those 3 years, and one of them was in the Championship as well. And that's how they got around it. That loophole has been closed apparently now, so they can't do that. But even if they do double it, it might not be enough. We're talking about several billion pound assets. Manchester United is valued at what, £5 billion? If we're talking £200 million over 3 years, so 70. Well, let's double it perfectly. 210. So you're talking £70 million a season on average. It doesn't seem like enough, and it's going to cause clubs to gamble. We're seeing it in the Championship, the amount of yo-yoing. Clubs are gambling by making their, spending over 200% of their revenue on wages alone. In some cases, I think the likes of Forest did that when they got up. The likes of, I think Stoke City have done that, Swansea City. It's insanity. It's a business model that is about as sustainable and as surefire and strong as a poppadom. It's just waiting to crumble, man. Anyway, can you tell I'm hungry thinking about food? But that's some of my thoughts on it, guys. There's a lot to it at the end of the day, and my word, honestly, the state of football right now. And with that, if you're watching the supercut of this, we'll get into some of the other things, of course, or we've already have spoken about some of the other things with modern football that really grinds my gears. I sound like an old man. I'm not even 30 years of age. But football back in my day was a lot different. I do prefer what it was like, and I know nostalgia comes into that, of course. I'm not going to pretend like the Premier League was ultra competitive in its early days. Manchester United won it 13 out of the first 20 seasons. That is not, in my mind, competitive. But you also had the outlier of having a freaking Sir Alex Ferguson there, so there is that too. There's honestly, there's so much we could go into with this, but overall, I would say since PSR has become a thing in the Premier League over the past 15 years, and when it's really come into the limelight in the last 5 years or so, I'd say the game is worse. From a fan point of view, things are worse. I think it's less competitive and less entertaining as a result. And I've lost a little bit of my passion for the game, because I know if my team gets promoted this season, which they might do, they'll probably get relegated next season. They'll get battered every week like Southampton, because we can't spend enough money to be competitive with those teams that are getting 90, 100 million pounds in the bank every single year for Premier League, rather than 5 million or whatever it is for the Championship, plus 15 million in parachute payments. It's just not sustainable. But it is, because it'll keep maintaining what it is. So, depends how you look at it. But guys, what do you think in the comments below? Let us know your thoughts. I want to hear what you have to say about PSR. Is it a good thing in football? Is it bad? I've made my opinion pretty clear. And of course, for much more football opinions and everything in between, keep it tuned here to thefootballchronicle.com. Like, share, comment, subscribe, ring the bell as well. And we'll see you soon, guys. Have a good one.